Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really digging into the economic journeys of India and China. And the current picture, well, it shows a pretty striking difference. If you look at 2023, India's GDP per capita was around 2,239 USD, China's over $12,000 USD, $1,274 to be exact.
Yeah, it's a huge gap now. But what's really interesting and maybe surprising to some is that this wasn't always the case. If you go back a few decades, India's GDP per capita was actually higher than China's.
That's incredible, isn't it? So the big question for us today is, how did that massive shift happen? What changed?
Exactly. What factors led to this, well, divergence?
To try and figure this out, we've been looking at a few key sources. There's an article from February 2025 called GDP per capita India versus China, How China Raced Away. We've also got the RBI annual report summary for 2023-24 that came out last May, and a working paper from back in 2015.
Right, the one titled Reducing Poverty in India, the Role of Economic Growth.
That's the one. So our goal here is to, understand what really fueled China's rapid growth compared to India, and also to look at where India stands now economically, its future prospects, especially thinking about poverty reduction.
Sounds good. So where should we start? Maybe that turning point you mentioned.
Yes, let's pinpoint that, because the data shows something quite specific happening around the late 70s, early 80s.
It really does. If you look at around 1979, China's GDP per capita was actually lower than India's. The article we read mentions India's was about 1.25 times higher than China's back then.
1.25 times higher. That really puts the current situation in perspective. So what happened next? How quickly did things change?
Well, just 5 years later, by 1984, they were almost neck and neck. India was at about 471 USD per capita, and China had just edged slightly ahead to $480.42 USD. Almost identical.
Wow, that's a rapid convergence. And does this line up with anything specific happening in China?
Absolutely. It coincides almost perfectly with the start of China's major economic reforms, which began in 1978-79.
Ah, okay, so those reforms had a pretty immediate impact then.
It certainly looks that way. The article points out that in those first 5 or 6 years after the reforms began, China's GDP per capita jumped by about $150.
$150. And India during that same period?
India's growth was much slower, only about $65 increase per capita.
So right there, in those initial years, you see China starting to pull away.
Exactly. That initial acceleration was quite significant.
And I assume that gap just kept growing.
It did, and quite dramatically. Fast forward to 1999, and China's GDP per capita was already almost double India's.
Double? Okay.
And then if you jump to, say, 2021 figures mentioned in the source, the gap is enormous. China at $11,188 per capita, India at $1,936. That's what, nearly 6 times higher for China, 5.8 times to be precise.
5.8 times. That really paints a picture of how different their economic trajectories have been since the late 70s. So the core question then is why? What were the key reasons China managed to race ahead like that, according to the sources?
Well, the article highlights 2 main drivers, really. First, China simply got a head start on major economic reforms. They began that process in earnest back in late 1978.
Right, you mentioned 78, 79.
Yes. They started shifting towards a more open, market-oriented economy, really focusing on integrating with the global economy. It was a fundamental shift.
And India, during that same time, what was the approach here?
India largely maintained its existing model, a planned economy with, significant protectionism, state control, and limited foreign involvement. The major liberalization push in India didn't really get going until about 1991.
So China had more than a decade's head start on those kinds of comprehensive market-focused reforms.
Pretty much, yeah. That early move towards opening up seems crucial.
Okay, so that's the first major factor, the timing of reforms. What was the second one?
The second key difference the article points to is the nature of their governments. China's centralized authoritarian system versus India's democratic framework.
How did that play into economic growth?
Well, the argument is that China's system allowed for very quick decision-making and policy implementation. They could push through major economic strategies from the top down without lengthy debates or needing broad consensus across different political groups.
Less friction in the system, perhaps.
You could say that. It allowed for speed and decisiveness in executing their economic plans.
Whereas in India, being a democracy, the process is naturally more complex.
Exactly. In India's democratic setup, you have multiple parties, regional interests, public debate, legal challenges, all of which are vital parts of the system, of course. But it does often mean that making and implementing big policy changes can take longer, requiring more negotiation and consensus building.
So it's not about saying one system is inherently better, but about how the structure impacted the speed of economic change?
Precisely. The source suggests that China's structure facilitated a faster, more forceful implementation of its economic agenda, especially in those critical early decades of reform.
Okay, that provides a clear picture of the key factors behind China's surge: early reforms and rapid implementation. Now let's pivot back to India. We have that working paper, Reducing Poverty in India. What does it tell us about the connection between growth and poverty here?
Yes, that paper really focuses on the role of economic growth itself in tackling poverty in India. It presents empirical evidence showing that growth in average incomes is responsible for a really significant chunk of the changes we see in poverty levels.
So as the overall economy grows, poverty tends to fall. It seems intuitive, but they actually break it down, right?
They do. They use a kind of mathematical approach to separate the impact of overall income growth from the impact of changes in how that income is distributed, inequality.
The growth effect versus the distribution effect.
Exactly. And what they find is that while income distribution or inequality does matter, it tends to be relatively stable or change slowly over time. It's the growth in average income per person that's usually the main engine driving poverty reduction, not just in India, but in many places.
And they found statistical proof for this in India's data. You mentioned econometric analysis.
Yes, basically using stats to test the relationship. Looking at data spanning 60 years, from 1951 to 2011, they found a clear negative link between the poverty rate and GDP per capita. As GDP per person went up, the poverty rate generally came down. And this relationship became particularly strong after the 1990s, coinciding with India's own economic reforms.
That reinforces the point about growth being key. Did the paper mention other factors too? I think you mentioned population earlier.
Yes, it did. It makes the point that slowing down population growth can also be a powerful lever for increasing GDP per capita and thus helping reduce poverty. It even notes, maybe with some concern, that government focus on smaller family sizes seem to lessen in more recent decades compared to earlier periods.
Interesting point. And what about inequality? Did that factor in? You mentioned the Gini coefficient.
Right, the Gini coefficient, it's a common measure of income inequality. Higher number means more inequality. And the paper found that while poverty decreased as incomes and consumption rose, it tended to increase when inequality, measured by the Gini coefficient, went up.
So growth helps, but if that growth is very unevenly shared, it blunts the impact on poverty reduction.
Exactly. It underscores the importance of inclusive growth, growth that benefits a wider section of society.
And how does growth actually translate into less poverty? Is it mainly through jobs?
That seems to be the primary mechanism. As the economy grows, businesses produce more, and that creates demand for workers' more jobs. The paper shows data for India, 1971 to 2011, linking GDP growth with employment growth, at least in the organized sector. Plus, there seems to be a long-run connection between GDP per capita and real wages for rural, unskilled workers, especially in the 2000s. Higher growth can lead to higher wages over time.
Okay, so jobs and wages are the link. Now, the paper also talks about social spending, right? Things like education and health.
It does. It acknowledges the argument, often associated with Amartya Sen, that social spending is crucial for poverty alleviation.
But it offers a bit of a counterpoint, or maybe a condition.
Well, it argues that while social spending is vital, sustained economic growth is what makes increased social spending possible. Growth generates more government revenue through taxes, which then allows the government to spend more on things like education, health, and welfare programs. Without growth, it's hard to scale up that social investment significantly.
So growth fuels the ability to invest socially. How does India compare internationally on that social spending front?
According to the paper, not that favorably, actually. When you look at government spending on education and health as a share of GDP, India's levels are significantly lower than many other emerging economies, and certainly lower than developed ones. Same story for per capita health spending, it's considerably lower in India.
That sounds like a major challenge.
It is. However, the paper also points out something interesting. Even though the share of GDP spent on social sectors might have been relatively flat, the absolute amount spent per person, in real terms, did increase significantly between 1980 and 2010. It tripled.
Ah, so because the overall economic pie was growing, even a stable slice meant more actual resources going towards social spending per person.
Precisely. It suggests that economic growth did help improve conditions for the poor, even if the share of national income dedicated to social spending didn't rise dramatically. growth still enabled more absolute spending.
Okay, that's a nuanced picture. Growth is critical, enabling social progress, but ideally you'd want both growth and a potentially larger share dedicated to social investment.
That seems to be the takeaway.
Right. Let's switch gears now to the present day and the near future. What does the RBI annual report from last year tell us about India's current economic health?
The RBI report for 2023-24 paints a fairly positive picture overall. It highlights strong economic expansion, with GDP growing by 7.6% in that fiscal year.
7.6% is quite robust. What about inflation? That's been a global headache.
Inflation did soften. Headline inflation came down to 5.4%, and core inflation, which excludes volatile food and energy prices, was lower at 4.3%. But the report does caution that food inflation remains a bit vulnerable to supply issues.
Okay. And externally, how is India positioned in the global economy?
The report says the external sector gained strength. The current account deficit, basically the difference between what India earns and spends abroad, narrowed. Importantly, investment, measured by gross fixed capital formation, increased, and the country's foreign exchange reserves hit an all-time high.
Those sound like solid fundamentals.
Generally, yes. They provide a buffer and indicate confidence.
So based on that, what's the outlook for this current year, 2024-25?
The outlook is positive, according to the RBI. They expect the momentum to continue, supported by those strong macroeconomic fundamentals you mentioned. They also point to healthy balance sheets in the financial and corporate sectors and a resilient external position.
What are the expected drivers of growth?
The government's focus on capital expenditure investing in infrastructure and fiscal consolidation is seen as a positive, likely boosting both investment and consumption. Also, hopes for a favorable monsoon should help the agricultural sector. And there's excitement about growth in emerging areas like renewables and semiconductors.
Sounds promising, but are there potential clouds on the horizon? Any risks mentioned?
Oh, definitely. The report is careful to note downside risks. Geopolitical tensions around the world, volatility in global commodity prices, those are external risks. Domestically, things like climate shocks, droughts, or floods impacting agriculture, for example, remain a concern.
Standard risks for a large, complex economy, I suppose. What is the RBI itself focusing on for this year? What's on their agenda?
Their priorities for 2024-25 include several key areas. One is strengthening financial inclusion, getting more people access to banking and financial services. Another is enhancing digital payment systems, making them more robust and accessible.
Technology seems key there.
Very much so. They're also planning to increase the use of data analytics and even AI in how they supervise and regulate the financial sector. Plus, they're reviewing guidelines for priority sector lending, that's lending directed towards specific sectors deemed important for development. And they're continuing work on the central bank digital currency, the e-rupee.
So quite a focus on modernizing the financial system, using tech, and ensuring broader access.
Exactly. It seems geared towards both stability and fostering inclusive growth.
Okay, let's try and tie this all together then. We started by seeing this incredible divergence between India and China's GDP per capita, with China pulling dramatically ahead after the late 1970s.
Right, and the key reasons seem to be China's much earlier start with comprehensive market reforms and a governance system that allowed for very rapid policy implementation.
Then we looked at India through the lens of that working paper, which really emphasized how crucial overall economic growth has been for reducing poverty here.
Yes, while also acknowledging that inequality can hinder that process, and that social investment, while important, is often enabled by that very growth.
And finally, the RBI report gives us a snapshot of India today, showing strong recent growth, generally positive fundamentals, and a decent outlook for the near future, despite some risks.
With a clear focus from the central bank on things like financial inclusion and leveraging technology.
It's fascinating, isn't it, when you lay it all out? The paths were different, the timing was different, but the fundamental importance of sustained economic growth comes through strongly in both the historical comparison and the current Indian context.
It really does. The China story shows what rapid, state-directed, reform-led growth can achieve in terms of transformation, while the Indian analysis highlights growth as the primary engine needed to lift large numbers out of poverty.
And the current RBI focus on inclusion and technology feels like an attempt to make sure future growth is perhaps more broad-based.
That seems to be the goal, yes. Making the financial system work better for more people, using modern tools. These are essential ingredients for making growth more sustainable and, hopefully, more equitable in the long run.
So the gap with China remains huge, obviously. But understanding how it emerged and focusing now on sustainable, inclusive growth powered by smart policies and maybe leveraging technology, that seems to be the path forward for India.
That's the challenge and the opportunity.
It leaves you wondering, though, what specific policy levers could really accelerate India's growth now, but in a way that's genuinely pro-poor, making sure the benefits reach everyone more effectively in the coming decades? That's something definitely worth thinking more about.